Welcome to Cleveland Connections, an online series from the Cleveland Council on World Affairs, where we discuss new developments and breaking news in U.S. foreign policy with thought leaders and subject matter experts, all of whom have a connection to Cleveland. Today, we're talking about the developing situation in Venezuela. Our guest is Dan Tirrell. Dan spent 14 years with the Office of Transition Initiatives at the U.S. Agency for International Development, including 4 years as the team leader for Latin America and the Caribbean, where he led U.S. efforts to support democratic transitions and prevent violence across the region. Dan grew up in Massachusetts and California, but he now lives in Cleveland, where he runs a nonprofit called the Ohio Democracy Project. Dan, thanks so much for joining us.
Marty, thanks for having me. I'm glad to be here.
So, we always start with a little bit of background on our guests. So, tell us about where you grew up and how you ended up working in international affairs and how you ended up in Cleveland.
Thanks. So, as you said, I grew up in Massachusetts and California, but I came to Cleveland via Romania, which is maybe not what you were expecting to hear. After school, I joined the Peace Corps, and during training in Romania, I met the woman who would become my wife, and she's from Shaker Heights. And so after the Peace Corps, which we completed together in Romania for 2 years, we moved back to Washington, D.C. And she ended up working for FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency. And I, as you said, went to USAID, as a lot of former Peace Corps volunteers do. Actually, before we went to D.C., I was in Afghanistan for a year and a half. That was my first USAID assignment. Then I came back and worked on Latin America and have since worked on projects in East Africa, in Ukraine, and Moldova, a range of things. But all of those projects had the common thread of being what I would describe as complex political crises, either political transitions or rapidly escalating violence. So all working on sort of conflict prevention and stabilization work throughout the world. But in doing that, a lot of my work while I was the team leader for Latin America and the Caribbean for OTI was focused on Venezuela.
Great. Well, I think with that background, supporting complex transitions, engaging with civil society across Latin America, you're really the perfect person to help our viewers understand what's happening inside Venezuela. And a lot of commentary around U.S. military action in Venezuela and what's still to come. What I would love to focus on today is what this means for Venezuela itself and what the future could hold for the people of that country. So maybe let's start with some context. Remind us how we got here, how Maduro came to power, what his regime looked like, and what the situation in Venezuela looked like prior to the events of the last couple of months.
Sure. And maybe first I should just remind your audience that this hasn't been my job for about a year. I was let go with everybody else from USAID about a year ago when the administration started. So it hasn't been my formal job to track this for at least a little while, but I do, of course, still pay a lot of attention to it, and I really care a lot about it. So the story could go back a very long way. I will probably start in 1992 when Hugo Chavez, who people have probably heard of and will figure prominently later in our story, attempted a coup against the democratic government of Venezuela in 1992. The democratic system in Venezuela before Chavez was a democratic system, but it was very dysfunctional, very a lot of income inequality, really elite driven. The people of Venezuela had a lot of legitimate grievances against their rulers and system of government. So Chavez attempted that coup in 1992. It was unsuccessful and he was arrested, but he was given a relatively lenient prison sentence and was pardoned after only 2 years and immediately re-entered the political arena. Um, and was elected legitimately in a democratic, free, fair election in 1998 as the president of Venezuela on a program of redistribution of oil wealth and massive social programs, very popular program, and driven by very legitimate critiques against the previous Venezuelan government not looking out for all of its people. But as we've seen in a lot of other places, Chavez, as president, immediately started implementing what we would now recognize as the 21st century authoritarian playbook of democratic backsliding, eroding independent institutions, co-opting civil society, packing the judiciary, influencing independent media, and changing the Constitution in 1999 to benefit his political party. So this sort of backsliding continued through the first decade of the 21st century. And at the same time, Oil revenue in Venezuela was very high. We were able to continue these social programs through that time. Chavez at some point also became sick with cancer, although the non-transparent nature of his administration makes it a little hard to tell when. But he eventually died in 2013 and was succeeded by his hand-picked vice president, Nicolas Maduro. And they had a relatively quick election in 2013 after Chavez died, when Maduro was elected from what are most accounts, was a free and fair election in 2013 as the president. But Maduro, as we saw over the next decade and a half or so, was no Hugo Chavez. He didn't have the charisma. He didn't have the same way of connecting with the Venezuelan population. So his administration immediately became much more repressive. And that corresponded with a reduction in the price of oil and a major economic crisis in Venezuela because all the social programs were dependent on a high oil price. So Venezuela, fairly immediately after Maduro came to power, spiraled into an economic crisis that was just a disaster for the country, for the industry. And people had been leaving for a long time, but the migrant crisis of Venezuelans leaving Venezuela really accelerated at that point when Maduro took over and the economic crisis hit. As of about 2020, later on, of 28 million Venezuelans, 8 million had left the country. So it's a huge burden on the rest of the region, especially in Colombia. It had political effects, of course, here in the United States that we're seeing now. But all over South and Latin America, countries really being amazingly welcoming to Venezuelans because they knew how bad the situation was there. But it was just really a complete economic meltdown. In that context, there was another presidential election in 2018, which was not free and fair. Maduro declared himself the winner, but there was a lot more political turmoil starting at this point. There was an interim government declared by the Independent National Assembly that was competing for power. It was never able to actually assert control, but it was a different form of politics than we'd seen. And then again in 2024, even more blatantly stolen election, which most independent observers would say that the opposition candidate, Edmundo Gonzalez, won by likely about 30 percentage points. The Maduro regime still declared themselves the winner and held on to power. And the opposition, although it did a really good job coalescing, was not really able to have any levers of actually taking political control of the country.
Thank you so much for that history. So you mentioned the political opposition. So we have all learned a lot in the last few months about a woman named Maria Corina Machado, who won the Nobel Peace Prize in 2025 for her efforts to resist the Maduro regime. And as you said, her political party also ran and won elections in 2024, although they never took office. Fast forwarding to where we are today with Maduro out of power, where does that leave Machado? Where does that leave the political opposition in the islands, in particular of Venezuelans?
Yeah. Corina Machado is an amazingly deserving winner of the Peace Prize, bringing together Venezuelan opposition that has not always been so coherent or cohesive and able to connect with the population. 2024 was probably the high point of that, in large part due to her leadership. She would have been the opposition presidential candidate if she hadn't been disqualified on spurious grounds in 2023, leading to the retired diplomat Edmundo Gonzalez running as the opposition candidate. But the opposition in Venezuela has always had a hard time connecting with the population. It's been very elite driven, very early on. It was certainly very elite driven. So it had a hard time competing with Chavez's message of economic redistribution and an economic system that worked for lower income Venezuelans. Where this leaves the opposition now is very hard to say, given how chaotic things have been over the last week. The Some speculation after the raid that removed Maduro was that Machado might come in as president, but she doesn't really have any democratic legitimacy as president, right? She wasn't elected president. Edmundo Gonzalez was elected president. So it's not really clear how she would do that. And based on what we've seen in terms of the changes in the Venezuelan regime in the last week, or maybe even less than a week, right? 4 days at this point. It's not clear that we're going to have any real regime change in terms of the nature of the regime, right? It was just a removal of the top figure of that regime. But in terms of a democratic opposition being able to take over Venezuela, we're a very long way from that right now.
So that's exactly where I wanted to go next as we think about this transition or non-transition that's happening in Venezuela. And we think about how we can support a country like Venezuela to make progress towards democracy. You have a lot of experience in places like Colombia, right next door, where there was a massive effort to kind of bring that country together and transition to democracy. Who are the kind of key players outside of government that we should be thinking about and paying attention to in terms of where their loyalties lie, what kind of statements they're making, or what efforts they're making through this political transition in Venezuela that might give us a clue about where this is headed?
Unfortunately, what we see in Venezuela and what we see in a lot of countries in the same position as Venezuela that have experienced long periods of democratic backsliding and authoritarianism is that there is very little independent civil society left within Venezuela. The people who were in any way independent of the government, even former allies of the government who weren't explicitly part of the PSUV, the ruling party, have pretty much been driven out or repressed, or there are still very large numbers of political prisoners within Venezuela. So that the existing civil society within Venezuela is basically non-existent, except for regime-linked and co-opted actors. So of course there are actors outside the country who are important, but not being inside the country, you almost always lose legitimacy immediately when you leave the country. It's one of the main challenges that oppositions going into exile have. So what I would say, and then in terms of actors to watch, they're not what I would describe as traditional civil society, but watching the loyalties of the armed forces, of the police, of regime-linked violent armed groups, the colectivos, which were formed to sort of support the regime. None of those are even close to independent civil society. But in the short term, the loyalty of those actors will be most determinative of whether the existing regime below Maduro can hold on to its spots. Over the medium to longer term, I would say it's very hard to predict what kind of civil society might emerge within Venezuela. These kinds of chaotic moments are ones where new actors that you'd never heard of before tend to emerge and play a really critical role. So this conversation might be quite a bit different a week or a month from now. Even just to give a quick example of when there were repressive actions against student protesters in Nicaragua in 2018, the most important civil society group in the immediate aftermath of that was a mothers group, a group of mothers of the students who had been repressed, that they had never been politically active before, but because of the actions that that regime took, they immediately became a really important actor with a lot of legitimacy. So we might see the emergence of similar groups in Venezuela over the next weeks and months, but it really depends a lot on the developments there.
Hmm. So putting on your former USAID OTI hat for a moment, as you think about the potential for a democratic transition in Venezuela, what would you like to see the USG doing if you were still at USAID, if you were still leading at OTI? What kind of plans would you be making? What kind of programs would you be thinking about implementing? And what would you like to see in this moment, even without USA, the USAID tool in the toolbox? What would you like to see the US government do right now to support progress toward democracy in Venezuela?
Yeah, thanks. Some of the best work that USAID and the broader community, right? There's a lot of really important people at the State Department and other parts of the US government who did fantastic work in these areas, was supporting as much of an independent civil society in Venezuela as could exist for as long as possible. And the idea behind that, and people like Maria Corina Machado emerged from that kind of civil society, right? She hasn't always just been part of a political party opposition. She came much more from the civil society world, and so have some of the most important leaders in Venezuela and other places that did lead their countries to a more democratic future. So that was some of the most important work that we were doing and that other U.S. government and international actors were doing previously. And I would that will be for as far as civil society in Venezuela and other authoritarian countries sinks, it always has to come back if there's going to be a democratic transition, right? You never have a democratic transition without independent civil society. And that includes all sorts of different kinds of civil society groups, right? Independent media, community groups, national groups, allied with political parties, but not co-opted by political parties. That has to come back, right? So I would love to see an effort to rebuild that in the service of a free democratic, independent Venezuela, which had been our policy through the democratic backsliding and authoritarianism of the Chavez and Maduro regimes. That had always been our policy, was to push for a free, democratic, independent Venezuela. It's not clear to me, given how things have gone over the last few days, that that still is U.S. government policy. But what I would hope to see in both our policy and our actions is to find those kernels of independence, of civil society, and really kernels not just of independence, but of courage and of innovation and of willingness to see a different future for Venezuela than it's experienced over the last 30 years or so, and to work hard for that future in the face of what will be a range of different challenges, right? The security situation in these situations almost always deteriorates. The international support fluctuates, right? But what I would love to see is a commitment to that independent, democratic, free Venezuela, and that we support it. But I'm not sure that without USAID, that we'll even have the capacity to do that, right? That our governmental capacity to support that kind of work and to support those kinds of brave people was mostly within USAID. Some of it was in OTI, but there was a lot of other parts of USAID that were really important, and a lot of other parts of the State Department that were really important that have mostly also been destroyed or at least vastly reduced in the last year. So it's not clear to me that we have that capacity now, but that is the capacity that is necessary to help countries like Venezuela achieve that democratic future.
Yeah, interesting. It's going to be an interesting dynamic to watch as the U.S. dives more into Venezuela, what capacity we can bring to the table, as you said, with the changes that have been made inside the U.S. government. So I want to end it by kind of bringing the conversation back around to home, back to Northeast Ohio. We always like to wrap up with a question around what does this mean for Cleveland? What does this mean for Northeast Ohio? We have, of course, a Venezuelan population here. We have a large Latin America population of both immigrants and visitors to Cleveland. We have companies that I'm sure are closely tracking the rhetoric and action around the oil industry. What does any of this mean for Clevelanders? What might we expect in terms of implications for us here? And is there anything that Clevelanders or Northeast Ohioans can be doing to help the situation in Venezuela to help further that democratic transition?
Yeah, thanks. One of the things that I always loved about working on and in Latin America and on behalf of the United States, right? Like I felt that role of being a representative of my country was and is how closely our histories and cultures are tied together, right? Like we are all part of this, one continent as most Latin Americans see it, right? They don't divide it into North and South America. We are America. And so I always loved that part of trying to work for more free and democratic and prosperous societies in this hemisphere. And that was what I loved about working on Venezuela, right? Our histories are really closely tied together. There are a lot of similarities in our political histories and how we achieved independence and our political trajectory since then. So sorry, I'm starting big and I'll get back to Cleveland. What happens in Venezuela affects us in Cleveland dramatically. It's huge. You mentioned the significant Venezuelan and Venezuelan American population in Cleveland. We have very large numbers, at least several thousands, probably tens of thousands of people of Venezuelan descent here in Cleveland. And so what happens in Venezuela affects all of us, but it of course especially affects that community. What I'm hearing from within that community now is a lot of fear, a lot of uncertainty, a lot of not being sure that even the United States government has their back in a way that we would have over the past 30 years. And so that's really hard for that community. So to your question of what we can do, finding ways of supporting that community, even in very small ways, right? In mutual aid, there's a fantastic Venezuelan restaurant over at Centro Via on the west side on West 25th Street. I had an arepa from there the other day. It's great. I highly recommend everybody support our Venezuelan neighbors in any way that we can. In a practical and policy sense, we've seen a lot of targeting of Venezuelans by ICE and CBP in terms of the immigration crackdown, right? And one potential policy implication of the changes within the last few days is that Venezuela may become more receptive to receiving Venezuelans who were in the United States in a way that they hadn't been under the Maduro regime. I'm not sure that that's going to happen, but it could, and that's part of the fear and uncertainty that people are feeling. And so supporting our communities in those ways, letting our Venezuelan and other Latin American neighbors know that they're a critical part of the Cleveland community and they make it so much richer, more prosperous, more vibrant is also a hugely important thing that we can do. So anytime anything happens in the world, there's always a Cleveland connection, but that's especially true with Latin America and Venezuela in particular because of the strong ties that we have.
Yeah, absolutely. And I will second the Centrovia recommendation. They've been a great partner for us. We've had some events there, great food over there. So I hope everyone makes it over there. Well, Dan, thanks so much for this conversation, for helping us think through what this means, both for Venezuelans and for Clevelanders, and for taking the time to be here.
Thanks, Marty. Really appreciate it.